Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here, and I'd really like to kick off by congratulating QED for organising and choosing this topic today. I do think it's high time that we have this debate on cross-border regulation, because I suppose the regulatory fragmentation, it's a lot of evidence that, it does have detrimental effect on the financial sector and the EU as a whole. And what's quite clear is that despite having a lot of shared policy objectives in the European financial sector as governments, as regulators, there are really huge number of inconsistencies when it comes to implementation of the international financial standards that have been agreed by governments. And what we do see is a number of national exceptions which could put our, the single market at risk. For example, when you look at UCITS or FMID, a directive allowing member states to perhaps go further than what has been agreed at the EU level. Now, these evolutions are of concern and do need to be tackled. So I think in very many ways, cross-border regulation really primarily first needs to be tackled by member states. And as member of Econ Committee, I've had first-hand experience of the negative impact of the growing fragmentation of European legislation. And my own experience on the Money Market Fund report as a rapporteur was that you couldn't find another file that was more divided along national interests. And so you had in one corner Luxembourg and Ireland, and then on the other one France. And so Luxembourg and Ireland supported by UK and France by Germany. And that did mean that I had to undertake a very extensive negotiations and to have discussions with representations and businesses of those member states to try and find a solution that would be acceptable to all the different parties. And it's quite interesting that having found a solution in the Parliament, and the report was voted in April, we can see that those vested interests are still really pretty strong in the Council, and they're being very, very timid. The Latvian presidency said, they didn't even want to tackle it. But I'm trying to encourage the Council to put the issue on the table and say, it is important that they try and find a common position. The second issue I think that is of interest is the differences in the national taxation systems. When we have a discussion on the common consolidated tax base for corporate taxation and the lack of European legal framework for insolvency procedures are really critical barriers towards having a real single internal market. Now, some would argue that this actually demonstrates a lack of trust amongst member states. Many of the larger states tend to focus on their own processes and traditions and think their system is the best. And, it's quite hard to convince them of the others. And if we could move on that, I think we would go a long way. But I think maybe where we could start, as what we need to do as a top priority, is first get an agreement on the policy objectives at European level. Now, they've got to agree, is it market stability concerns, or systemic risk, or consumer protection? What are the issues where we can have some common agreement? So, because we don't have that, instead of having a truly common European framework, we often end up with legislation which is some of national interest, with significant number of exceptions, and this is detrimental to the functioning of the single market in the financial sector. I think we do have to recognise that allowing national authorities to go further than European legislation does in itself create discrepancies. Whilst, I know many of the national exceptions are justifiable, as a whole they do undermine the concept of the single market. So, and in turn have a protectionist effect and reduce the EU financial legislation to kind of fragmented patchwork of legislation. I think one of the things I find really, really hard is how do you defend this when we're talking about better regulation? So we're talking about better regulation perspective, and we're always concerned about, adding cost of compliance, and we're focusing on reducing the cost to the consumer and improving systemic risk, but you can't deal with those things in one country and not in others. I think the important thing, and it's hard for me to say this as an elected representative myself, but that commissioners and MEPs do come from these member states and are accountable to those the public in those member states. So you can clearly see there is a national bias when you're looking at certain pieces of legislation, and I'm well aware that MEPs are influenced by their national representations significantly. So that's why I started off with saying that some of these issues have to be first tackled in member states. And once they recognise that it's in their interest to have a well-functioning internal market, instead of sort of maintaining their status quo or their national system, I think it would be difficult to move forward. But I do think we have a big opportunity now with the Commission's proposal on the Capital Markets Union. I think it's a very important initiative, and it could tackle a national fragmentation. However, real CMU cannot be limited to just initiatives or review of the Prospectus Directive or the framework for securitisation. It does need to address more controversial points in an appropriate way, like European legislative framework for insolvency and, as I said earlier, taxation. And also maybe the different fiscal treatment for debt compared to equity in member states. Now, moving quickly on to the global level, recognising that financial markets operate on a global scale. I think really we're looking at the US and the EU as the world's biggest markets, and accounting for some 80% of financial transactions. Now, acknowledging that they have different structures within the financial markets, one being more bank-based, the other one being more market-based. But it is important that there are similarities, and that therefore there should be some similarities in the financial legislation as well. Now, before the financial crisis, some would argue that there was a much more relaxed attitude towards each other. The expression was, not a more favourable treatment of third country service providers, with a tendency towards mutual recognition of each other's systems. And that reflects a lot more trust between those two parties and systems at that time. But from the beginning of the financial crisis, although there has been some convergence through the objectives set in the G20 regulatory agenda, and we've adopted in the EU some 40 new pieces of legislation on capital requirements for banks, on credit rating agencies, and on derivatives. In the US, the same topics have been covered and regulated through Dodd-Frank Act. Yet, At the same time, you know, it has led to, I would say, greater protectionist by restricting market access to third parties. And in the EU, access for third parties is governed by the equivalence requirement, or the need for equivalence decisions of third country regulatory regimes.